This is the story of my mom cleaned his palace for 20 years as it truly unfolded. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the funeral, when grief still hung in the air like incense that refused to fade. Sheikh Khalil al-Mansouri stood in his marble-floored study overlooking Central Park, holding a letter that would unravel 20 years of assumptions about the woman who had cleaned his New York penthouse every day at dawn. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, each word formed with the precision of someone who understood that some truths could only be spoken once. Inside, folded between pages of careful script, were photographs he had never seen and a confession that would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the invisible threads that bind strangers into family. If you're already feeling the weight of this moment, take a second to like the video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These stories carry more meaning when we know who's listening, because what Sheikh Khalil discovered that morning would force him to confront a question that haunts every person of privilege. How well do we really know the people who make our lives possible? Maria Santos had been cleaning his penthouse for 2 decades, arriving each morning at 5:30 with a quiet efficiency that never demanded attention or acknowledgement. She moved through his 30-room residence like a ghost who understood the sacred nature of other people's spaces, polishing surfaces that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, arranging flowers that would be replaced before they could wilt, maintaining an environment of perfection that allowed Sheikh Khalil to focus on the empire he was building across 3 continents. She spoke little English when she started, communicating through gestures and the universal language of work well done. Over the years, her vocabulary expanded, but their conversations remained brief, professional, bounded by the invisible walls that separate employers from employees, the wealthy from those who serve them. What Sheikh Khalil never knew was that Maria had been documenting everything, not his business dealings or personal conversations, but something far more intimate and devastating. In her careful handwriting, she had been recording the gradual transformation of a man she watched struggle with the weight of inherited wealth and the expectations of a family dynasty that stretched back generations. She had witnessed his late-night phone calls with his father in Dubai, conversations conducted in rapid Arabic that she couldn't understand but whose emotional tenor was unmistakable. She had seen him standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows at 3 in the morning, looking out at a city that never slept, carrying the burden of decisions that affected thousands of employees across his various enterprises. But Maria's secret went deeper than observation. The letter revealed that she had been using her position in ways that would have shocked Sheikh Khalil had he discovered them while she was alive. Every month, she had been photographing documents left on his desk, not for espionage or blackmail, but to understand the man whose life she had been quietly stewarding for 20 years. She had learned to read financial statements, to understand the language of corporate responsibility and philanthropic giving. She had been studying him, not to exploit his vulnerabilities, but to find ways to amplify his better instincts. The photographs tucked inside her letter told a story that Sheikh Khalil had never seen from his own perspective. There he was, captured through Maria's hidden camera, sitting at his dining table on Thanksgiving morning, alone with a feast prepared by his chef, but untouched because he had nowhere to go. No family in America to share the holiday that had become increasingly important to him as his ties to this country deepened. There he was again, on Christmas Eve, working late into the night on a proposal to fund after-school programs in Detroit, a city he had never visited, but whose struggles he had been quietly addressing through anonymous donations coordinated through shell companies that protected his privacy. Maria had been documenting his acts of generosity that he kept hidden from the world, his late-night research into social justice organizations, his careful study of immigration policy and refugee resettlement programs. She had photographed him crying after phone calls with his sister in London, conversations about their father's declining health and the pressure to return to Dubai to take over responsibilities he wasn't sure he wanted. She had captured moments of vulnerability that no one else had been allowed to witness, creating an archive of a man struggling to reconcile his privileged position with his growing understanding of the world's inequities. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Maria's letter explained that she had been using the information she gathered not to betray his trust, but to become his secret partner in philanthropy. She had been identifying needs in the communities where she lived, in the Bronx neighborhood where she raised her 3 children as a single mother, and then finding ways to bring those needs to Sheikh Khalil's attention without revealing her role in the process. The after-school program in Detroit that he had funded. Maria had researched it after her nephew moved there and struggled to find safe places to spend his afternoons. The scholarship fund for undocumented students that he had established through his foundation. Maria had proposed it through a series of anonymous letters that she had been sending to his office for years. Letters he had assumed came from concerned citizens, but which had actually been carefully crafted by a woman who cleaned his floors and understood his heart better than he understood it himself. What would you have done, discovering that someone you barely acknowledged had been orchestrating your moral education for 2 decades? Would you have felt betrayed by the deception or humbled by the dedication? Sheikh Khalil sat in his study as the morning light shifted across the Persian rugs that Maria had vacuumed thousands of times, trying to process the magnitude of what he was learning. The letter continued for pages, detailing specific instances where Maria had influenced his decisions without his knowledge. The community center in Chicago that he had visited and subsequently funded. Maria had arranged for him to drive past it during a business trip, coordinating with his driver to take a route that would expose him to the neighborhood's needs. The interfaith dialogue program he had supported in Los Angeles. Maria had left articles about religious tolerance strategically placed in his home office, knowing his habit of reading everything that crossed his desk. She'd been shaping his consciousness with the patience of a master gardener, planting seeds of awareness that would bloom into action months or years later. She had understood something about influence that most people never grasp, that the most profound changes happen not through confrontation or argument, but through the gradual accumulation of exposure to truth. She had been teaching him to see beyond the walls of his penthouse, to understand his responsibility not just to his shareholders and family legacy, but to the broader human community of which he was a part. The letter revealed that Maria had been attending night school for 15 years, earning first her GED, then an associate degree in social work, then a bachelor's degree in non-profit management. She had been studying the systems of inequality that kept people like her invisible to people like him, not to resent the disparity, but to understand how to bridge it. She had been preparing herself to become a more effective advocate for the communities she knew he could help, if only he could see them clearly. But Maria's secret went even deeper. The letter explained that she had been saving every penny of her salary for 20 years, living in the same small apartment in the Bronx, wearing the same modest clothes, never taking vacations or buying luxuries, because she had been building something. With the money she earned cleaning his palace, she had been funding her own foundation, a small organization that provided emergency assistance to undocumented families facing deportation, medical crises, or housing instability. She had been using her proximity to wealth to understand how money could be deployed most effectively, then applying those lessons to her own modest resources. The photographs showed her at community meetings in church basements, at immigration hearings where she served as a translator, at hospital bedsides where she held the hands of people who had no one else. She had been living a double life, not out of deception, but out of necessity. She understood that her effectiveness as an advocate depended partly on her invisibility, on her ability to move between worlds without drawing attention to the connections she was making. Sheikh Khalil found himself remembering moments that now took on new meaning. The way Maria had always seemed to anticipate his needs, having coffee ready when he woke up troubled, leaving small notes of encouragement on days when his business dealings had been particularly stressful. He had attributed her attentiveness to professional dedication, but now he understood it as something deeper. She had been caring for him with the same attention she brought to her community work, seeing him not as an employer but as a human being whose well-being was connected to her own. The letter's final pages contained Maria's last request, and it was not what Sheikh Khalil expected. She didn't ask for money for her children or recognition for her years of service. Instead, she asked him to visit the places where she had lived and worked, to meet the people she had been helping with the foundation she had built with his unknowing partnership. She wanted him to see the community that had been shaped by his generosity, filtered through her understanding of what was needed most urgently. She had left him detailed instructions, addresses in the Bronx where families had been kept together because of emergency rent assistance, names of students who had graduated from college because of scholarship programs, locations of community gardens that had been planted with grants she had helped him discover. She wanted him to understand that his wealth had been working in ways he had never imagined, creating ripples of change that extended far beyond the tax-deductible donations processed by his accountants. But Maria's final revelation was the most profound. She explained that her 3 children, now adults, had all been inspired by watching their mother's dedication to service. Her eldest daughter had become a teacher in the same neighborhood where they had grown up, working with immigrant children who reminded her of her own family's struggles. Her son had become a social worker, specializing in helping families navigate the complex systems of public assistance and legal immigration. Her youngest daughter had started a non-profit organization that provided translation services and legal aid to undocumented workers. Maria had been raising a family of advocates, using the stability that her job in Sheikh Khalil's penthouse had provided to create a legacy of service that would continue long after she was gone. She had transformed his unknowing generosity into a multi-generational commitment to justice, proving that the most powerful philanthropy happens not in boardrooms or gala dinners, but in the daily choices of people who understand that their own liberation is bound up with the liberation of their communities. The letter ended with an invitation that would require Sheikh Khalil to step outside every comfort zone he had carefully constructed. Maria asked him to attend a memorial service in her honor, not in a funeral home or church, but in the community center in the Bronx, where she had volunteered for years. She wanted him to meet her children, her neighbors, the people whose lives had been touched by the foundation she had built with his unknowing support. She wanted him to see himself through their eyes, not as a distant benefactor, but as a partner in the work of creating a more just world. Sheikh Khalil spent the rest of that Tuesday walking through his penthouse, seeing it for the first time through Maria's eyes. Every surface she had cleaned, every room she had organized, every detail she had perfected had been an act of care that extended far beyond the professional relationship he had imagined. She had been creating a space where he could think clearly about his responsibilities, where he could make decisions that would affect thousands of people, where he could grow into the kind of leader his wealth and position demanded him to become. He found himself remembering conversations they had shared over the years, brief exchanges that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now revealed themselves as carefully planted seeds. The way she had mentioned her daughter's graduation from college, not asking for anything but sharing her pride in a way that had made him think about educational access. The way she had talked about her neighborhood's need for a new playground, not requesting his help, but simply sharing information that had later influenced his decision to fund similar projects in other cities. Maria had been teaching him about power and responsibility through the most subtle curriculum imaginable, showing him how wealth could be transformed into justice through the patient work of building relationships and understanding needs. She had been preparing him for this moment, when he would have to choose between the comfortable distance of traditional philanthropy and the more challenging work of genuine partnership with the communities his money could serve. The memorial service was held on a Saturday afternoon in October, when the Bronx was painted in the colors of autumn, and the community center buzzed with the energy of people who had gathered to celebrate a life that had touched theirs in countless ways. Sheikh Khalil arrived in a simple car, wearing clothes that wouldn't draw attention, carrying flowers that Maria's daughter had requested instead of the elaborate arrangements his assistant had initially ordered. The room was filled with people whose stories he had been unknowingly supporting for years. There was Carmen, the single mother whose family had avoided eviction because of emergency assistance from Maria's foundation. There was David, the teenager who had received a scholarship to study engineering and was now working to bring clean water technology to underserved communities. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman whose medical bills had been covered by a fund that Maria had established using connections she had made through her work in Sheikh Khalil's world. As he listened to their stories, Sheikh Khalil began to understand the true scope of Maria's secret. She had been building a network of mutual support that connected his resources to their needs in ways that preserved dignity and fostered empowerment rather than dependence. She had been creating a model of philanthropy that he had never seen before, one based on relationship and understanding rather than charity and distance. Maria's eldest daughter, Carmen, approached him during the reception with a proposal that would test everything he thought he knew about his role in the world. She explained that her mother had left detailed plans for expanding the foundation's work, but that success would require a level of partnership that went far beyond writing checks. She asked Sheikh Khalil to consider becoming not just a donor, but a student learning from the communities he wanted to serve before presuming to know what they needed. The proposal was both simple and revolutionary. Sheikh Khalil would spend one day each month working alongside the foundation's volunteers, not as a celebrity benefactor making appearances, but as a participant in the daily work of community building. He would help serve meals at the soup kitchen, assist with English language classes for new immigrants, participate in community meetings where residents discuss their needs and priorities. He would learn to see the world through the eyes of people whose struggles he had only understood as statistics. The offer represented everything that Sheikh Khalil's upbringing and social position had taught him to avoid. It would require him to give up the protective distance that wealth provides, to risk the discomfort of being seen as a person rather than a position, to acknowledge that his education in privilege had left him unprepared for the most important work of his life. But as he stood in that community center, surrounded by the evidence of Maria's 20-year curriculum in compassion, Sheikh Khalil realized that she had been preparing him for this choice all along. Every small gesture of care she had shown him, every moment of quiet attention to his well-being, had been teaching him about the reciprocal nature of human dignity. She had been showing him that service is not something the wealthy do for the poor, but something people do for each other when they recognize their fundamental interconnectedness. He accepted Carmen's proposal that afternoon, beginning a partnership that would transform not just his approach to philanthropy, but his understanding of his own purpose in the world. Over the following months, he would learn to navigate subway systems and community meetings, to listen more than he spoke, to ask questions that came from genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. He would discover that the most meaningful change happens not in boardrooms or foundation offices, but in the daily interactions between people who choose to see each other as fully human. He would learn that his wealth was not a burden to be managed or a privilege to be enjoyed, but a tool that could be used to amplify the wisdom and strength that already existed in communities that had been overlooked by traditional philanthropy. The transformation was not immediate or easy. Sheikh Khalil struggled with the discomfort of being a beginner in spaces where others were experts, of having his assumptions challenged by people whose life experiences had taught them truths he was only beginning to understand. But he persisted, guided by Maria's example and supported by her children, who had inherited their mother's gift for seeing potential where others saw only problems. 6 months after Maria's memorial service, Sheikh Khalil stood in the same community center, but now it was filled with the energy of a celebration rather than mourning. The foundation had expanded its programs to include job training, small business development, and advocacy for policy changes that would address the root causes of the problems they had been treating symptomatically. The work was harder and more complex than anything Sheikh Khalil had done in his business career, but it was also more meaningful. As he watched Maria's youngest daughter lead a workshop on financial literacy for teenage mothers, Sheikh Khalil understood that Maria's secret had been about more than hidden philanthropy or covert influence. She had been demonstrating a different way of being in the world, one that recognized wealth and poverty, privilege and struggle, not as fixed categories that separated people, but as temporary conditions that could be transformed through the patient work of building authentic relationships. Maria had spent 20 years cleaning his palace, but her real work had been cleaning the barriers between his world and hers, creating pathways for understanding and partnership that would outlast them both. She had left him not just a foundation to support, but a new way of understanding his responsibility to use his privilege in service of justice. If this story has moved you to think differently about the invisible people who make your life possible, consider subscribing to hear more stories that challenge us to see beyond our assumptions. And maybe, like Sheikh Khalil, you'll find ways to transform your own advantages into opportunities for others to thrive. The last photograph in Maria's letter showed Sheikh Khalil from behind, standing at his penthouse window in the early morning light, looking out at a city full of people whose stories he was only beginning to understand. She had captured him at the moment of awakening, poised between the world he had inherited and the world he was choosing to help create.